Hello, my name is Valerie Rudivali. I'm Director of Development at the Missouri Botanical Garden. Thank you for joining us for tonight's inaugural Words and Wine book discussion, a collaboration between the St. Louis Public Library and the Garden. This three-part series is inspired by the upcoming exhibition at the Garden's Stephen and Peter Sachs Museum called Grafting the Grape: American Grapevine Rootstock in Missouri and the World. It opens next month and runs through March 2022. I want to thank the Garden's Volunteer Leadership Board, the Corporate Council, led by Council Chair Linda Lockwood of Regions Bank, and also the library staff, led by Kathy Heimberger, Director of Marketing and Programming, for coming together to create this three-part Words and Wine series. Glenn Bargette, from the Missouri Wine and Grape Board and columnist for Sauce Magazine, is our expert panelist for tonight's discussion of The Wild Vine, A Forgotten Grape and the Untold Story of American Wine by Todd Kleiman. Christine LaBarbera of the St. Louis Public Library will be fielding your questions. If you have any questions for Glenn during the presentation, please submit them using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Now we will hear from Waller Mcguire, Executive Director of the St. Louis Public Library, and then begin our discussion.
Thank you, Valerie. I am Waller Mcguire, and I'm honored to lead the St. Louis Public Library and welcome you tonight on the library's behalf and on behalf of the Botanical Garden. St. Louis has an extraordinary cultural and educational landscape, from its universities and museums, its theaters, its concert halls, its symphony. It offers amazing opportunities. For most of us, though, the Missouri Botanical Garden holds a special place in our hearts, a place of peace and beauty and fascination, a place more important to us and to the world, now more than ever. As a librarian, I think of the garden's remarkable role as educator and library, one of the world's most extraordinary libraries. We're proud to partner with the garden, and we've done so in many ways for years, and we look forward to doing so in different ways in the future. You may be able to glimpse another of the world's great libraries through the windows over my shoulder. Our central library is an architectural masterpiece, but the architecture pales before the collections it protects and offers. Right now, the Stedman Collection, an incredible rare books collection, is on display in the Great Hall as part of a beautiful St. Louis architectural exhibit. And our 16 neighborhood libraries offer remarkable possibilities of their own. America's public libraries are the envy of the world, and we invite you to use and enjoy them wherever you are. They belong to you. I'm going to turn you over to two people who will host and enlighten you this evening. Christine LaBarbera is a librarian at Central Library. I last heard Christine hosting a virtual program on the owl families of Forest Park. So from owls to wine, you get some idea of the breadth of knowledge a librarian has to call upon. Glenn Bargette is probably known to many of you from his responsibilities at Annie Gunn's or his work as a respected wine reviewer and judge. The recognitions and awards he's received for his knowledge and love of wine are varied and impressive. And he's taught college courses on wine appreciation for a number of years. We're fortunate to have him with us this evening to mix the worlds of wine and words and to share with us some of what he's learned and enjoyed through his career in wine. I am in my office, so perhaps it's best that I don't have a glass of wine in my hand, but I hope that many of you do. And I join the garden in hoping you enjoy tonight's program and visit us for the rest of the series and come and see us often. Christine and Glenn, over to you.
Thank you, Waller. And thank you, everybody, for joining us tonight. As Valerie said, this is a discussion, and we'd love to know what questions you have about wine. So please feel free to put them at the Q&A section. It should be at the bottom panel of your screen. I challenge you to try to stump the wine expert. To get things started, though, Glenn, I was wondering if you could elaborate on a few terms for any of us wine newbies. Terms like terroir, vinifera, and foxiness.
Okay, terroir is pretty much. First of all, thank you for inviting me to to the event this evening. I love talking about wine, and I love talking about Missouri wine. I love talking about Missouri Norton most of all. And something I didn't have on my resume, I did teach at the Botanical Garden for quite a few years in the kitchen back in there. I did wine courses for quite a number of years back in the kitchen. So this is coming home. Anyway, terroir. Terroir is the part of the wine that's other than the grape. It's the dirt, it's the sun, it's the mountains, it's the history. Terroir determines essentially what kind of grapes you can grow. Why you can grow certain grapes in Missouri and grow certain grapes in California, grow certain grapes in Bordeaux. Those are determined by the terroir. Terroir is basically the part of the grape that you really have almost, if any, control over whatsoever. It's the climate. Missouri has different terroir than Minnesota or Florida. It's obvious when you start thinking about it. It's really the place. It's why certain grapes are famous in some places. Why Norton's famous in Missouri, because our terroir for Norton is outstanding. And I think we do a better job with Norton than anybody else that grows it in the country. It's not grown in a lot of states. It's probably, I'm guessing Norton is probably grown in maybe 8 or 10 states. That's just a guess. That could be high or low, but it's a relatively small amount compared to other grape varieties. But even things like Cabernet Sauvignon aren't grown in that many states because the climate just isn't right for it. We all know what kind of climate Missouri has. It's too hot. It's too cold. It's too humid. It's too erratic. Too many mosquitoes. There's a lot of reasons that wines don't want to grow here, but there's a lot of history that makes it a reason that we do have here. So terroir is a long answer to your question. It's the everything you can't control in winemaking. The next question was vinifera.
Vinifera, yeah.
Vinifera is the family of grapes that everybody knows. You go to a restaurant, you go to a retail wine shop, you see pretty much, if not 100%, pretty close to 100% vinifera on wine labels. Grapes like Chardonnay, Cabernet Sauvignon, Riesling, Pinot Noir. Those are all varieties that are in a family called vinifera. Those are varieties that came out of Europe. The European varieties, because they've been doing it for so long, they figured out 1,000 years ago what grows in Bordeaux and what grows in Burgundy and what grows in Germany and what grows in Italy. They know that. The New World's a little different game. Everywhere Europeans went and stole the country from the indigenous peoples, they planted grapes. Whether it was the United States or America at the time, whether it's South America, whether it's New Zealand, Australia, South Africa, anywhere that Europeans went, they tried to make wine and grow grapes and make wine. And it worked in some places, it didn't work in others. In South America or South Africa, you had a climate similar to Europe, so it was a little simpler. When they came to the New World to Americas, they hit the wrong coast. So the European grape varieties weren't suited for growing on the East Coast. The climate wasn't right. So it took them a long time to figure out the West Coast of the United States is the place to grow European grape varieties. So that's a long answer to your question too. Vinifera are the varieties from Europe. We don't basically grow vinifera in Missouri. We don't have a climate that allows for it. You can plant them and they can live, but when you get weather like we get in Missouri, where the temperature can swing from 60 degrees to -10 in a couple of days, you can't grow those kind of varieties. Our climate's just too erratic.
And then is that where the foxiness in wine comes from, or is that specific to Norton?
Foxiness is a term that I've railed against my entire life because it's something that writers have used to describe anything they don't understand, because it's a negative description of a wine. Foxiness probably came from the idea that this wine smells like wet dog hair, and which is a negative. There's no way to make that a positive part of winemaking. But that's I think where foxiness came from, because when you you taste grapes like, let's just say the most famous of the Foxy type grapes is Concord grapes, Concord grape juice, Welch's grape juice, the kind of grape juice that everybody loves. That's not designed for fine wine. It's designed for jelly and juice. So if wines are made from those, you can make a wine from them, and a lot of wineries make a lot of money because people like sweet wines. But those are not those. You don't make fine wine. You don't make wine for cuisine, for dining, necessarily with those kind of grapes generally. But you can make very delicious wines. But foxiness was a term I think that wine writers in many cases could have been academics too, that came up with it as a negative description for something that's normal in a grape.
Okay, Gail asks, I have a 2000 bottle, I guess it's year 2000 bottle of Norton. Is it ready to open?
You have a corkscrew?
Gail, do you?
I've got a 2009 here in front of me from Stone Hill, which I've had numerous times. And it's drinking wonderfully, but it's still got time in it. A 2000 Norton should still be fine, but it's not going to get any better.
Okay.
Every wine has a life curve. Every wine, any kind of wine, anywhere in the world, white, pink, sparkling, anything. Every wine has a curve. Starts out as a grape, winds up as vinegar. 100% of the time, that's what every wine is going to face. You start out as a grape. If you wait too long, it winds up as vinegar. The idea is to get it before it hits that. When you get to the top of the peak where the wine is at perfection, some wines, and perfection is a floating scale on wines in general, but some wines they'll hit their best and they might stay there for years. Some hit their best and maybe just drop off and they're shot in a year. It's always a bad idea to wait too long. You're always better off drinking a wine too young than too old.
So open it, Gail.
Open it.
Open it right now.
And it may have sediment, very likely have sediment. So you may have to decant it. If decanting a wine is carefully pouring off the clear wine from the sediment that collects in the bottle. Because if you don't decant it, you're going to wind up with a glass full of sludge, and that's not proper either. Okay. So yeah, just decant it into if you have a decanter, use that. If you have a 32-ounce jelly jar, use that. You can use anything to decant into it. You just want to pour the clear wine off of the sediment.
Kathleen has a question. I moved here from Virginia last summer, somewhat like the Norton. Why did the Norton leave Virginia, and is it grown more here than there now, and why?
Well, it didn't leave Virginia because grapes don't have to leave. They can just they can move, but they're still part of something else. The Norton grape is still in Virginia, very strong in Virginia. So it grew as people moved west. As the reputation for the Norton grape grew through competitions and people tasting it and better winemaking and such, it became more popular as civilization moved west. It started in the probably 1830s in Virginia, then came through Tennessee, Kentucky, into Arkansas, and then up into Missouri. Probably the mid to late 1800s got into Missouri. So it's been here a long time. But I've had some fabulous Nortons from Virginia. Now I do have a prejudiced opinion that I've built by listening to people from all over the world tasting wines from various places from the Norton grape. Norton is probably considered to be the best grape in Missouri, and Missouri probably is considered to be the best producer of Norton. As in Missouri, Norton is a focus. In Virginia, you can grow Vinifera, those grapes I was talking about a few minutes ago. So if you're in Virginia and you can grow Cabernet and Chardonnay and Riesling, those are much easier to sell to a consumer than a Norton. People walk into a restaurant or a retail shop and see wine on the shelf. A lot of people aren't going to recognize the name Norton. They will in Missouri because it's our primary grape. It's the largest selling grape in Missouri. But if you're in Virginia, where you can still grow vinifera, it's more of a challenge. So if you're in Kentucky or Tennessee, you're probably doing about more Norton. If you're in Arkansas, a little bit warmer than Missouri, they do grow vinifera in Arkansas. They grow Cabernet and such in Arkansas. Missouri, because of our climate, has a really difficult time. There are a couple of vinifera producers here that make a small amount, but it's a huge amount of work because of the freeze. The freeze just ruined. You might have grapes or a vine that the last 5, 6, 7 years. Then you get one of those terrible winters that come through, and then the vine gets killed. So you have to start all over again. You can't make a winery if you have to plant new grapes every 5 or 6 years.
Sure.
So you want old vineyards. You want to establish old vineyards to produce better and better wine as the vineyards get older, and that's really hard to do in Missouri with vinifera.
Well, that kind of moves into the next question. Scott asks, how many years are normally required to cultivate? How many years are normally required to cultivate the ground to produce a viable wine? Is the cultivation of the ground or the aging of the wine more critical?
Okay, I have to translate that into you plant a grapevine, and if it's a young cutting, you've got something that is maybe not much bigger than a pencil, and over 6 or 7 years, 5 or 6 years, that will grow vertically and then eventually horizontally onto the wires, and you'll have a grapevine that will produce fruit. There's no real cultivation of the land once you have that in there. You cultivate the land to get rid of weeds and to make sure that there's enough nutrients in the soil and such. But you're not really working the soil as much as you would like with standard farming, with other kind of agricultural products. But a grapevine from scratch, if the grapevine is 3 or 4 years old, you'll start getting fruit from it. But you'll get maybe a full amount of fruit when it's maybe 7, 8 years old. And then it'll hold there. It could be 20, 30, 40, 50 years. It depends on how long that particular vine. It's like people. Some people last longer than others. But the grapes that are produced typically are better once the vine gets more age on it. A young grapevine produces less fruit and less complex fruit. The complexity of grapes is something that comes from aging of the vine.
So if you had a young grape and then you aged the wine, would that help or no? Is that?
Well, it wouldn't necessarily work at all. Because if you have a young vineyard, you produce simpler wines, and simpler wines don't age. So so they might be totally delicious when they're 1 or 2 or 3 years old, but they aren't the kind of wine that you would want to keep for 10 or 15 or 20 years. Like the lady just had the 2000 Norton.
Sure.
A 2000 Norton, if it's made from a 3-year-old vineyard, may very well be over the hill right now. If it's a 2000 Norton made from an older vineyard, there's a very good chance that the wine is still viable. I wouldn't wait too much longer. But as I've had Nortons 30 or 40 years old that are interesting in an academic sense. It's not that the wine tastes that good. It's that you're experiencing a snapshot of a year of a place. If you're drinking a 20-year-old Norton from Herman or Augusta, you're getting a picture of that vintage of that year in your mind, because wines last longer than you think, but they don't necessarily always get better. The oldest wine I ever had was an 1823 Madeira. Madeira is a wine from Portugal. It's actually from the island of Madeira off the coast of Portugal, and it's the oldest wine I've ever had. This is probably 20, 30 years ago. So the wine at the time was a century and a half old, and Madeira is a wine that lasts forever. Because it's a sweet wine, it's a high alcohol wine. And the wine was interesting. It wasn't exciting, but it was interesting. What was exciting was that it was 1823 and Thomas Jefferson was still alive. And I was drinking a wine made from grapes that were harvested when Thomas Jefferson was alive. that was what it was exciting to me about the wine. It wasn't the flavor of the wine or the history of the wine. It was that I'm drinking something that has that kind of longevity. My dad was born in 1916, and I gave him a 1916 Madeira for Christmas one year, and he died a few years ago. But now I take a sip every year on Father's Day and on his birthday of that wine, because it lasts forever. Even when that's one of the few wines, once it's open, it still doesn't go bad. You take the Norton in my glass. This might be okay tomorrow, but by Sunday or Monday, it'll be a good amount of vinegar by then. Okay. Where a Madeira lasts forever. So anyway, I got off the Missouri track a little bit, but that's the part about wine, because it's not one thing. It's a constantly moving. It's a moving target. With Norton, I'm getting ahead a little bit, but with Norton, as ageability goes, Stonehill Winery does a 10-year. They haven't done it because of the pandemic, but they do a 10-year vertical tasting every spring. A vertical tasting is 10 vintages at one time, so you'll taste 10 years of Norton all at once. You'll have 10 glasses in front of you, and they've done this for 30 years. I've been to all 30 tastings, so I've got 300 years of notes of Norton. But when you sit there looking at 10 vintages, you see how the color changes. But before you even smell it, how the color is, the first vintage is like 6 months old, and it's almost like a neon purple. You almost think it's electric. It's so brightly neon, and that gradually changes to brick and gradually changes to brown as the wines get older. Because wine, think of slicing an apple or a banana.
Sure.
And if you don't do something to it, it turns brown. Wine does the same thing, it just takes longer. But anything that is a natural product, eventually white wines turn brown, red wines turn brown.
Kathleen
says, as a long answer to a short question.
Kathleen says, I had difficulty finding Norton wine from Virginia at Total Wine. They
Right.
only offered local wines from Norton.
Right.
It's not so much a question, but is there a place she could find a Norton wine or a Virginia Norton?
Probably not. Okay. Yeah, just like you wouldn't find a Missouri Norton in Virginia.
Okay.
Now you when you have like California, Oregon, Washington, which combined are probably well over 90% of the wine made in the United States. That's a juggernaut of wine marketing power and shelf placement dominance. And whether it's a restaurant or a retail shop, you put things in there that are going to sell. If you put a Norton on a shelf in California, they're not going to have any idea what it is. Whenever we go to California to visit, because when I go out there, the person visit is to meet with winemakers and vineyard people. I always take a case of Norton, and I give those out like Johnny Appleseed when I'm when visiting wineries. And it's amazing. Almost every winemaker knows Norton. Wow. Now the consumers don't. The people in the street, the wine drinkers in the world, unless you're in a state that makes it, you're not going to know what Norton is. But the winemakers really love it because it's something different. When you're in California, every year they say every year is a great year in California. That's not true. But every year is a good year. You rarely have I can't think of a year where the wines were poor. The wines are different levels of good to great, but you never have a poor year typically, unless there's a major weather issue. So to me, it kind of gets boring. Here's another good Cabernet. Here's another good Cabernet.
Sure.
Yeah, and even with other varieties, Pinot Noir and Syrah and Zinfandel and such, you bring them something that they don't have access to. There are a couple of wineries in California planting Norton. It's probably not going to do very well because the climate's just not right. It's just like we don't grow oranges in Missouri. We don't grow bananas in Missouri. Sure. You grow what the land wants to produce. That's why every state pretty much has a different type of. All 50 states have wineries, but there's a huge difference in what the wines are made from depending on where you are.
Carolyn asks, is the Norton grown in areas overseas, like Europe?
Not Europe, but well, they tried to grow it in Europe, and that's where the problem with the phylloxera came from. Because that's another whole story, which could take a while. I think this. I heard somebody in Japan was playing with it. If you think of the climate in Missouri, we don't have a European climate, but we do have a climate similar to parts of Croatia or Slovenia. We may have some areas like that could grow it. And the Far East, in India and China, because they've got a growing middle class wine consumers. They're trying to develop a wine culture. So they're trying everything to see what happens. It takes a long time to figure out what's going to grow. If you plant the wrong thing, you've lost 15 to 20 years of work, and to find out that you planted the wrong thing, you got to pull it out and start something else. You don't have a lot, and you can only do it once a year. It's not like corn or alfalfa or something where you can keep trying different things. To plant a grapevine and grow the grapes and make the wine, and then taste the wine and find out we don't like the way the wine tastes. Even if it's a grape that you know, like a grape that grows great in other places, if you grow it in a place where it doesn't want to grow, and it may even grow relatively well, doesn't mean the fruit's going to taste good. So it's a long process to figure out what's going to grow best in your area. The time that I've been involved with the Missouri wineries, there were grapes that we had 30 years ago that you don't even see anymore, because they were grapes that they thought might work here. And then everything kind of got squeezed out by Norton. Norton was a tough one to grow early on, but now they figured out how to grow it and how to make the wine, how to age it, the wood aging and such. And Missouri Nortons are really stunning. We have the other red grape that we grow here is Chambourcin, and that's a French hybrid. That's a grape that was developed in France. Norton's a natural mutation that came out of Virginia. So Norton only came from the United States. Chambourcin, our other red grape, was developed by botanists in France in the late 1800s.
Here's a question that's related to the book. Is it true that Missouri grapes saved the vineyards of Europe?
Yeah, that's where I was getting a few minutes ago. Well, there's a little bug called phylloxera. I normally would have a card up here that says phylloxera. So phylloxera is a tiny little bug, and what phylloxera likes to live on is grapevine roots. They like to eat the roots of the grapevines. American grapes are immune from phylloxera. It doesn't like to eat American roots. So phylloxera was never an issue. When things like Norton became popular in Europe, like winning awards in Europe in the late 1800s, there was interest in American grape varieties. So they started sending American grape varieties to Europe to see what would grow over there. Grape varieties move all over the world. All these European Vinifera varieties, Cabernet, Chardonnay, etc., all those came from Europe in the 1800s. At the same time, they were sending things like Norton to Europe to see if they would grow over there. When they took Norton to Europe, phylloxera came along with the ride. So phylloxera arrives in Europe, never having seen a Cabernet vine or a Riesling vine or a Pinot Noir vine, and phylloxera goes nuts eating through the vineyards of Europe over a 20 or 30, 40-year period. So the phylloxera that went over because of all the experimentation killed the European grape vineyards over a couple decade period. Did the same thing in California. California went from about 12,000 acres in the 1880s to 3,000 acres in the 1890s because phylloxera got to California too. So the vineyards in Europe had a problem. They've got phylloxera, which lives in the dirt. So you can't spray it, you can't get rid of it because it lives in the dirt. So how do you get rid of phylloxera? So two botanists, horticulturists from Herman, C.B. Riley and Dr. Hussman, came up with the idea of grafting European grape varieties onto American grape variety rootstock, not necessarily Norton, but could have been Norton. So you take Norton roots, which are the part of the vine that sticks in the dirt, and that's where the phylloxera lives. And then you take a Cabernet or Pinot Noir or Chardonnay vine and graft it onto the rootstock. So you've got everything above the ground is vinifera, everything below the ground is an American rootstock. So the vine is getting all the nutrients and the moisture and everything that it needs through the American roots, but the phylloxera isn't attacking the vine because it has American roots. So the long answer to your question is yes, Missouri rootstocks save the vineyards of Europe. But the part of the story that they don't tell you is that American rootstocks also destroyed the grapes of Europe because they destroyed it, then they figured out how to fix it. That's what Americans do. We make a mistake and then we go in and fix it. And since it was how we did agriculture, a century and a half ago. But there's actually a statue in I believe it's in Montpellier in southern France of a young woman with an old woman on her back. And it's a very famous statue.
That's in the book. Yeah.
It's a very famous statue. And it's the young woman is the American roots and the old woman is the European grapevine on top.
In the book, Kleiman focuses on the town of Hermann, Missouri as a major player in wine during the 19th century. He says, if you wanted to talk about wine in America and you lived in the 19th century, you pretty much had to talk about Missouri. The book is now a little more than 10 years old. Can you talk about Hermann and Missouri winemaking now? How much has changed in 10 years? And how many vineyards are producing wine?
Okay, well, first of all, we need to define what vineyard is. A vineyard and a winery are two different things. A vineyard is agriculture, and a winery is a business. So you have wineries that don't have vineyards, and you have vineyards that don't have wineries. So in Missouri, there's 1,700 acres of grapes. How many vineyards that is, I don't know, but there's 125 wineries. So 125 wineries, some are growing all their own grapes, some are growing most of their own grapes. Some are growing none of their own grapes. So I can tell you the number of wineries and the number of acres of vineyards. That's about the only information that we have, not knowing who's selling to who. The challenge for wineries is that the Missouri industry would expand faster than it is if there were more vineyards available. But just to grow grapes and sell grapes to a winery is really on a business basis, it's a really hard challenge to make enough money. In California, if you're in Napa Valley, you can get $25,000-$30,000 a ton for Cabernet Sauvignon grapes. In Missouri, you probably don't get $1,000 a ton for anything. So you still have the same amount. You pay for the same tractor, the same a bottling line. The equipment is pretty much the same, but you're not getting the revenue from it. So the idea that people are going to invest in a vineyard and not be a winery is a very, very tough thing in Missouri, which is why most, like Stonehill, grows a lot of their own fruit. I think Augusta and Montel grow almost all their own fruit. I think St. James grows almost all their own fruit. It's one way to assure your production, and one way to ensure that you can expand your vineyards, your wineries, by expanding your vineyards. But it's a huge challenge. And your first question was about the last 10 years. I think that winemaking everywhere is getting better. California wines are getting better. European wines are getting better. Every year that a winemaker makes a wine, they learn something that they didn't know last year. So every year whether it's a new grape variety possibly, or a way to blend, or whether it's a screw top versus a cork closure, it could be anything. But winemaking is a very trial and error business, and you've only. I remember when my first time I visited Missouri Winery, it was 1973, And I was visiting here from Hawaii. I'm from St. Louis, but I lived in Hawaii at the time. And I met Lucian Dressel at Mount Pleasant Winery. And he made the statement, he said, at best, I might have 40 or 45 vintages in me. So you have to learn quick. There's no way to experiment very much, because if it doesn't work, you may only have to wait till next year. You may have to pull out the vineyard and start all over again. So it's a long process to learn this stuff. The Missouri industry restarted in 1965 with Stonehill Winery. The California industry, I always look at Robert Mondavi opening his winery in 1966 as really the rebirth of California wine, where there was a California winery. There were a lot of wineries in California that were there in the 1800s. Prohibition knocked them all out. So things didn't really start in the United States until the mid 60s. So we're a 50-year-old industry. But you look at France or Italy or Germany or Spain, they're doing it for thousands of years. So, I mean, they're already looking to American technology because Americans are willing to learn. Not quite the same with Europeans sometimes. They have their way of doing something. If you're making wine in a certain area, you make it a certain way with certain grapes and a certain style, and that's the way you do it. In the United States, like, how can we make it better? What can we do? Can we grow a different grape? Can we do a different barrel? Can we do a different yeast? So we're more in a hurry to figure out how to do it, maybe, than some of the parts of the world. It's a total ongoing process wherever you are.
Mary asks, what did getting the first appellation in U.S. really mean, and why was it such an honor?
It wasn't. I happened to be there, actually. I was at the hearing in Augusta in 1980. In Europe, they have a system. It's called an Appellation Contrôlée system in France. It's a Denomination Contrôlée system in Italy and Spain. These are the legislated bodies, basically, that regulate how to make wine, what grapes you can grow, how you label the wine, etc. And in the late 1970s, the BATF, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, they came up with a program to have American viticultural areas designated, something they're trying to kind of copy from the way that the Europeans have made wine for hundreds of years. And so they came up with this American viticultural area thing, and that they as everything the federal government does, they have a lot of farms. So you had farms and applications to fill out, and you had to be very specific about why you thought your region was specific and what's so important about where you are, and so there was a very detailed amount of information that they had to do in the application. Well, when this proposal came out, everybody in the country, Napa Valley, Oregon was nothing there, Washington State was nothing. It's really just California and a few eastern states. But in Missouri and Augusta, there were only two wineries, Montel Winery and Mount Pleasant Winery. And there were only two wineries, and they quickly filled out the information, drew the borders around the AVA, the appellation in there, and they did a very good job of selling the program and the history and the distinctiveness of everything in Augusta to the people of the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms. So they were given the first AVA. Napa Valley was about 8 months later. But you think of Napa Valley, even at that time, Napa Valley probably had 100 wineries, maybe more. Well, 100 wineries trying to agree on something versus two, it was just a lot longer process. So since Augusta got everything filed and they had the hearing in the VFW hall in Augusta, they were awarded the AVA #1, which is that's a big deal. It's a great question on wine trivia games. What's AVA #1? Nobody thinks of Missouri.
Here's a quote from the book. Journalism, particularly food and wine journalism, is a comfortably status quo profession, which is to say an exceedingly lazy profession, disinclined to probe for truths and content to convey news of prevailing trends. Do you agree with Kleiman's assessment? Do you think bad PR has hurt Missouri Missouri wines and native grapes?
Okay, bad PR didn't hurt Missouri wines. Bad Missouri wines hurt Missouri wines. So as the industry started in 1965 in Missouri, so you had a handful of wines. Now we're up to 125. A winery, and we don't have 125 people making good wine. Just like in Napa Valley, you don't have 500 people making good wine. There's a range of quality everywhere you are in the wine world. So in Missouri, if people started visiting wineries in the early days and they tasted the bad wine, they never went back. Now, what's happened to help the Missouri industry in the last few years is that baby boomers like myself, we're fading away, and these are the people that supported these wineries early on, and were the most critical of the poor quality that was out there. Because as everybody was, when the wineries reopened in '65, reopened or opened, there were no professional winemakers. They were all mom and pop. They took courses, they read books, they did the best they could with what they had. There was no support system. Now we have a Missouri Grape Board. We have Department of Agriculture that's very involved in the Missouri industry. We've got professional winemakers. We've got college-trained winemakers. As the industry grew in Missouri, the quality grew because they understood that they had to get professional winemaking, not just mom and pop winemakers. So one of the things that's always just irritated the crap out of me for years is that people say Missouri wines aren't any good. I said, when's the last time you had one? And typically it's 15 years ago. They don't know what they're talking about. The wineries in Missouri learn something every year, just like the wineries anywhere else. And the quality of winemaking here is very, very solid. And the consistency at the upper level. There's I went to an Italian tasting in New York a couple of years ago, and there was a whole room full of bad wine. Hundreds of wineries. And these were all wineries that didn't have an importer. They were looking for importers in the United States. And I said, well, there's a reason they don't have importers. There's not a good wine in the whole room. And these were families that some of them had been in business for 100 years. Just because you're in a good place for somebody to make good wine doesn't mean you're in a good place for everybody to make good wine. And there's a lot of anti-Missouri prejudice. It's because it's easier to say Missouri rather than learning something new, like what is a Norton, what is a Chambourcin, what's a Vidal Blanc. It's easier to kind of criticize that the wines aren't any good. The idea that wines never change is totally wrong. If you visit Missouri wines 5 years ago, you don't know what's going on now. Things are improving so quickly. And I'm in a similar price range, I would put Missouri wines up against almost anywhere in the world. If you took a $15 or $20 Missouri wine up against $20 Italian or Spanish or French, I think we'd be right in there with quality. But we taste different. Just like broccoli tastes different than cauliflower. Our grapes taste different. And if you're used to Cabernet, Italian wines taste different. Because Italians don't grow Cabernet. So you got to open up your mind a little bit to understand what we do here. And my comment on Missouri wines has always been, if you're a wine lover and you can drive an hour to a winery, what a luxury. Yeah. Most of us live in the St. Louis area, right here. From where most of us are right now, within 2 hours, you can probably visit 50 wineries. That's pretty cool.
There's debate about the Cynthiana and the Norton being the same plant in the book, with scientists saying they're genetically identical and winemakers relying on their palate and observations to tell them that they're different. What are your thoughts?
Well, I'm quite sure they're the same. Okay. I'm not a scientist, but I'm quite sure they're the same. Cynthiana was used early on as a name for the grape in Missouri, until they figured out Norton is easier to market. It's a simpler name if you're trying to market a product than Cynthiana. And as I understand, Cynthiana was a name that they used for the wild grape when it was discovered in Virginia. The wild grape that they discovered I think they were calling it Cynthiana. It's called Norton because of Dr. Norton, who basically took a wild grape and domesticated it and put his name on it. If you're the one that does the work, you can put your name on it. So Norton is really the one that took off as a marketable name, and the one that more people were using. You would occasionally see in Missouri wineries, a winery would make a Norton and a Cynthiana, and typically the Norton was the more complex, the more ageable, the barrel aged wine, and Cynthiana would have been lighter, fruitier, more drinkable young. They would take the same grapes and make two different styles for people that wanted a different style of taste than they would, rather than waiting a couple of years to age a Norton in a wood barrel. So even wineries that grow both thought it was the same. They thought, well, we'll make two different wines and we'll use both names. Cynthiana's, there isn't very much use of that term anymore. And that really changed also when the Missouri legislature named Norton as the official Missouri state grape. We got the bluebird, we got
right.
these things that we do that are the state flower, such. But when we made the state grape, there was no way. And we dealt with that on the board. So, well, how are we going to deal with Norton Cynthiana as the state grape? It's already confusing to have a grape that nobody's heard of, and now we get two names for it. So we made this decision. We're just going to go with Norton because it's the more marketable of the two, and that's pretty much the way it's worked. There's very little Cynthiana out there anymore. There is some other states might still be using that, but in Missouri it's pretty much all Norton.
There are two similar questions. What effect on Missouri wine do you think the Hoffman family purchasing Augusta wineries in mass will have? What are your thoughts about the changes coming to Augusta from vintners in Napa Valley?
Well, they aren't from Napa Valley.
I think it's just both like changes to Augusta.
Okay. There's several issues here. When I first heard about the Hoffmans coming to town, my first concern was what's going to happen to all my friends in Augusta. So I started talking to them. Almost every one of them said, this is probably going to be a really good thing. The Hoffman family, and I have met them, and I felt much better after talking to them that this is going to be really good. Everything they've done in the business world is first class, and they're trying to do a more of a destination of Augusta, as opposed to 5 or 6 or 7 different wineries trying to bring people in on their own. So they're buying up property because if you're gonna be in the wine business, you need land. So they started by buying the land, and then buying up wineries. But they're leaving the families that own the wineries pretty much in charge of the wineries, at least in the short term until the whole project gets done. But they're talking about hotels and golf courses and things that are really bringing tourism to the area. And Missouri is driven by tourism. There's a lot of agriculture, but the wine business is one of the few businesses that you really overlap agriculture and tourism. And it's one of the reasons the legislature always loves the wine business, because it's a non-polluting industry, and a lot of the state is involved in this. So I think the Hoffmans are going to do a really good job in Augusta. The people that have sold out to them seem confident that they're going to do it first class. Very nice people. Well, they're local people. They're from Washington, Missouri. Mr. and Mrs. Hoffman both went to high school in Washington and then moved to Florida, where they were very successful in business. But they're committed to doing a major job in Augusta. Now, that's just their focus is Augusta. I don't think they're talking about like buying up St. James and buying up Herman. I don't have a feeling that that's their plan. But the idea that they can do something really first class to draw in national or international tourism to the Augusta area. That's and with our grapes. My first concern was that they would be a winery bringing in California juice or California bottled wine and selling it there. That doesn't seem to be the plan. So I'm very positive with what they're trying to do out there.
Diana asks, can you talk about the oak barrels of Missouri? I hear the French love to age their wine in them.
Oak has become pretty much the wood of choice for wine aging because it's very sturdy, it's very solid, and it has a nice flavor. Some wood doesn't have flavor, and some wood has too much sap, like pine has sap. You don't want that. So oak barrels are aged anywhere from 24 to 36 months. They'll age the wood before the barrels are made. So by doing that, you dry out the sap, but you build a lot of character into the wood itself. Then when the barrels are made, they'll toast them and the toasting over an open fire. The toasting gives a flavor to the wine, and complex wines, in many cases, are made more complex with the use of oak. Stainless steel barrels are excellent for winemaking, but they don't add any character. It's a neutral vessel, where an oak barrel adds flavor. And I always look at things like a chicken breast. A chicken breast in a microwave is really boring, but chicken breast with the right amount of sauce and spicing and grilling or whatever, you can put a lot of flavor into it by what you do to it. And an oak barrel is one of the flavors that you can manipulate wine with. You can add yeast to wine that makes a change. The time of harvest can be a difference, but the type of barrel. And in France they have a lot of different kinds of wood, and some people prefer one forest over another, and some prefer different types of toast. Some like a heavy toast where the barrel's almost charred inside. Some just like a light toast where you get a little bit of flavor. Most white wines are not aged in wood, but things like Chardonnay typically are, because Chardonnay is kind of a neutral flavor, but you can add a lot of great character by putting in a wood barrel. And the light reds typically are not aged in wood, but things like Norton needs some wood. Norton needs some wood to kind of tame it down.
Ginger says, I'm not too fond of reds, but want to enjoy one now and then with friends. How is the Norton different from the Vinifera reds?
Well, it's like, how's a peach different from a plum? I mean, it's just two different things. Now, a Norton as a grape variety, because it's not vinifera, it's a different world. Norton is also it's a huge high pigment grape, so you get a huge amount of color because there's relatively little juice, so you get a little bit of juice for a lot of skin, so you get a lot of color there, and it's got kind of there's a strong characteristic to Norton, which is why it takes wood to kind of tame it down. And Norton is aged very well for that reason. Now, if there's no way to compare, like you can't say Missouri Norton, oh, it tastes like Cabernet. It doesn't. It's a different grape variety. The one of the descriptors I like for Norton that it's more poetic than scientific. That Norton tastes like, to me, Norton tastes like Northwest Italy, or Norton tastes like Southeast France. Not a grape. It reminds me of a place. Like so, if you're in a sidewalk restaurant in northern Italy or southern France, probably taste wines that have some similarities to these. It's not the same thing. It's like when people taste, say you taste lamb and pork and beef. Not everybody can tell one from another. They all bring something different to the program. That doesn't make one better or worse than any other ones. But there are differences in grape varieties, and because wines, unlike beer, beer you bring in the products from anywhere, and you cook it and you make a beer. So that's why you see breweries everywhere. Wines are a reflection of a fruit, and that fruit is typically, well, traditionally, that fruit is the name that's going to wind up on the label, because wines that are labeled by the grape name are called varietal wines. So if you see a wine that says Cabernet Sauvignon, you know it's at least 75% Cabernet. Or if it says Pinot Noir, it's 75% Pinot Noir. If it says Norton, it's at least 75% Norton. In the case of Norton, it's more than likely 100%. So it's an education process to get people to understand what these names mean. When you see these and you don't recognize the name, you don't recognize Vignoble or Traminette or Vidal Blanc or Seyval Blanc, all the grapes that we grow here. But once you get into it, if somebody is interested in Missouri wines, I always suggest take a Monday or a Tuesday and drive to a winery when they're not busy and say, I want to learn about wine. They'll be thrilled to see you, and they'll be thrilled to tell you everything that they're doing, everything that they've accomplished and they're planning to do with the grapes that they're growing. The misconceptions about Missouri wines are trying to compare them too closely to other things. They're distinctive, and then I've got 1,000 wines on my wine list. Do I need 1,000 wines? No, but I've got 1,000 because that's the way the business works. Sometimes I'm just so thrilled to taste something different. It's like, people that eat the same food every day or drink the same coffee every day, but there's so many wonderful products to enjoy, and then especially when you get into like this 2009 that I've got here. This would be a hard wine to identify if let's say you didn't know anything about Norton and you're tasting this with an experienced wine drinker. They certainly would not think Missouri. They probably wouldn't think American. The style of Missouri wines in general is more European than domestic because of the acidity. The acidity, the acid levels in Missouri wines is more similar to the wines of Europe than the wines of California.
We're running out of time, and we've had so many great questions and far too many to answer all in this session, but there's one question I'm going to ask because several people have asked it. What are some of your favorite Missouri wines, and can you recommend a good Norton?
No. Here's the reason. I'm on the wine board and I'm friends with all these wineries. So how do you pick? What the best way, as I was suggesting a few minutes ago, the only way to learn about Missouri wines or any wines is to get them in your mouth. Classes that I've taught for years, whether they're Missouri wine classes or French wine classes or California classes, you'd say, okay, what do you taste? What is this? What would you serve with this? Is this pleasant? Is this young? Is it harsh? Most Norton is made in Missouri. When we do our state wine judging, a couple of years ago we had 55 Nortons to judge. Typically we have about 300 wines in the judging. We had 55 Nortons. We wound up giving about 12 gold medals because the consistency was so good for a wide range of producers. We're very fortunate to have great wineries all around the state, whether it's Herman or Augusta or St. James or the central part of the state. The western part of the state's getting a lot of attention right now, and southern part down around St. Genevieve and such. So there's a lot of places to visit, whether it's a weekend or during the week, that would be happy to show you around. To say try a certain winery or something, that's really difficult to do. It's like picking your favorite children. You're always going to get in trouble with one of them.
Which one though?
If you forget your youngest child's name, you're never going to live it down. So I'm very, very fond of the state. I mean, in good and bad. There are poorly made wines here that have turned around and made really, really good wines because somebody else is making the wine or whatever. These are it's a moving target. But the overall quality of the wines, I've been such a fan for, oh my gosh, 45 years now. So get out there and try them. And retailers have been really supportive. Restaurants a little less so. You know, I would have Missouri wines in any wine list, but I've got about 25 Missouri wines on my list, and I love showing them to people. But the retailer, whether it's with a supermarket retailer or wine shops, there's been a pretty good amount of support from Missouri wineries from the retail side of the industry. So it's pretty easy to find most of these things, or at least something. If you're looking for Nortons, you can probably go to a shop and find 5 or 6 or 8 different Nortons, or Vignola if you like a sweet white, or Chardonnay if you like a dry white. Missouri rosés, Missouri sparklings, Missouri ports. I mean, in any category of wine, Missouri makes something that would be appealing. You could easily do a dinner with almost any menu and pick a Missouri wine to go with every course, almost any menu. In some cases, more versatile than even California wines, because we have a wider range of flavors.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Glenn. Valerie, I'm going to have you take over and conclude the evening.
I didn't use my notes.
Look at that.
I didn't even get to my notes yet.
Well, thank you, Glenn, and thank you, Christine. Between the conversation this evening and the book, The Wild Vine, I think many of us are feeling very inspired to get out there and explore our Missouri wineries and get to drinking those Nortons and figure out which ones are our favorites. So thank you for sharing the conversation and your knowledge. This is all the time we have for this evening's program. But if your question was not answered, please look out for a response from us via email. I want to thank Waller for kicking off the Words and Wine series. And I'm grateful to Glenn for spending this evening with us and leading us in a lively wine-inspired discussion. I also want to thank all of you, members of both the Garden and the St. Louis Public Library, for being with us. The work of the Garden and the library truly would not be possible without you, and we are grateful for your ongoing support. We invite you to join us for our next Words and Wine program on Thursday, July 8th at 7 p.m., also via Zoom. The featured book will be The Botanist and the Vintner by Christy Campbell. Dr. Peter Wise Jackson, president of the Missouri Botanical Garden, will be here to welcome us. Expert panelists will be Dr. Wendy Applequist, Missouri Botanical Garden Associate Scientist, and Dr. Dean Vollenberg, Director of the Grape and Wine Institute at the University of Missouri. Please call our office or go online to secure your spot. You will receive an email tomorrow morning containing a link to register for the next event. And finally, you may check out the book from the St. Louis Public Library or buy it at a discount from Subterranean Books or Left Bank Books. Thank you again. Have a wonderful evening.
Thank you.